Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's discipline data webinar as part of the Fixed School Discipline Policy Coalition. Everyone is being admitted to the meeting, and we are about to start. My name is Ruth Cusick. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-founder of the Collective for Liberatory Lawyering and part of the facilitation team of the Fixed School Discipline Policy Coalition, which we co-lead with the Black Parallel School Board and the Public Council Education Rights team. Jose Solano Jimenez and I will just be sharing a few kind of context setting bits of information and then be passing it over to the amazing data team for the UCLA Center for Civil Rights Remedies, who will be leading this session. Thank you all for joining us. This session will focus on California data analysis, but we look forward, if you're joining us from another state or even another country, for you to use it in your work. Okay, so go ahead, Jose, to the next slide. So as we begin this dialogue, we just want to ground this conversation and all of our conversations from a human rights solidarity lens. The Fixed School Discipline Policy Coalition works in close alignment with the Dignity in Schools campaign of California. The Dignity in Schools campaign of California is really almost a kind of movement heart center for school to prison pipeline, confrontation, education, racial justice organizing of parents, young people, and intergenerational organizing by Black, Brown, and other impacted communities across the state. What you see on the slide in front of you is actually from our national Dignity in Schools campaign, Human Rights Model Code, where we worked together over multiple years and in 2011 released really what was our vision for shifting school discipline, safety, and all connected policies around conditions for learning in our schools from a human rights framework. So you can see here that the 5 chapters of that model code were education, participation, dignity, freedom from discrimination, monitoring, and accountability. In our own statewide Fixed School Discipline Policy Coalition, we have monthly membership meetings by which we dialogue for folks working, on legislative issues in Sacramento to folks leading local campaigns in the Central Valley, San Bernardino, across the state, to ensure that that work happens from a human rights solidarity lens with and centering base building groups and impacted communities. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I'll pass to Jose to share a bit more about our tools.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ruth. My name is Jose Solano. I am the Fixed School Discipline Coordinator at Public Council, and we just wanted to take this opportunity in a moment to share about the Fixed School Discipline website, fixedschooldiscipline.org. On it, we have a number of resources available to you. We have resources by topic that you can look at. We also have a couple of toolkits for educators, for community, and also we have a mini toolkit that is both available in Spanish and in English. You can access it at the website, you could download it for free, and you could also subscribe to our email listserv by adding your email on here. So if you haven't visited the website, take a moment to look at it in your free time, and you can access more information. I'm gonna pause and I'm gonna pass it over to Dan Lawson, who will lead the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, it's a great honor to be able to work with the Fixed School Discipline Coalition and to present to all of you. This presentation was put together by myself and research associates Grace Shin and Mahreen Alam. So let's go to the next slide. I'll tell you a little bit about our organization and about myself, and then we'll be talking about the way to look at school discipline data in the context of the school to prison pipeline and concerns in California. Some of the findings here are from our they're very disturbing findings from a report that we released in March called Disabling Inequity, the Urgent Need for Race-Conscious Resource Remedies. And we have data on every district in the nation, and you can find that the spreadsheets for your district on our, and you'll see this at the end, we have actually 2 websites where you can find these reports. We also will be talking about a prior report that looks at trend analysis in various rates of discipline across the state of California and in every district within the state. And we have some preliminary findings from the release of the 2019-2020 data and some advice about how to look at data that is really just based on 2/3 of the school year. Next slide, please. So first, just a few things about me before I became a researcher and a lawyer. I was a school teacher for about 10 years in the public schools in Massachusetts. And one of the things I think it's important for me to say is that I was a teacher who was kicking kids out of my classroom right and left when I started teaching. I did not have good classroom management skills, fortunately, and I was, I sent more kids to the principal's office than any other teacher in my school. And my principal came to me and said, "Dan, you have a classroom management problem." She pointed out how I lost all authority in front of the kids by relying on her all the time. And she did not suspend these students. I should keep that, I should make that clear. But there were things that I was doing that out of frustration that I know because I received training not to do now, including things like many times I kept the entire classroom in for recess when there were several things that had happened in the classroom, but I couldn't figure out who was to blame. That's just an example. I also, more recently, and this is not something that I like to disclose, but I feel it's important, I took a test of implicit bias, and I did find that I have slight racial bias against Black people. So that's important because not out of guilt, but because it's important to recognize that implicit bias informs a lot of what we do, but it is something you can take action to correct. And part of that is taking a very, open and honest look at data. Some things I learned as a teacher, though, as I pointed out, I did receive training, and I went from suspending kids or kicking them out of my classroom, at least right and left, to never even thinking about sending them to the principal's office. And some of the things I learned in that first year included just training that taught me to look for kids and point out when they were doing things right, not escalating when I thought a student was being disrespectful to me. So checking my ego at the door, making sure I was tracking all the students, including the ones I found most annoying, and thinking about their strengths and finding genuine things that they were doing really well, and then calling their parents. And in many cases, parents of some of these students had never gotten a positive call from a teacher ever. And the other thing is to reflect on what you're doing in the classroom. And so it's not enough to say that I'm not discriminating. I think it's really important to think in terms of being anti-racist. What are you doing in a positive way? And a quick story here that my second year, I was told that one of the Black students who had a disability might have to leave our program if his test results came back and it turned out he was mentally retarded. Now, that didn't actually happen, but the fact of the matter is I knew the student wasn't mentally retarded and I didn't say anything about it. And I didn't point out that in many ways the student was doing just fine, even though there were issues and I needed support in working with him. The fact that I would just defer to some IQ test is, a reflection of, maybe not being discriminatory, but also not being anti-racist, because I would have let that happen at the time. I did consult with the special educators and I said, well, I guess if that's what the test scores say, then that's what has to happen. I wouldn't do that today, but at the time, that's something that I think it's important to acknowledge. Next slide, please. So one of the important findings of our recent national report, Disabling Inequity, which was released in March, is that there's a whole subset of students who do have disabilities. That means they have a disability that substantially impairs a major life activity, which means they are eligible for all sorts of supports and services under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, even though they don't need specialized instruction. So they may not, and they're called 504 only because in many cases, they are not eligible under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This subset, now it could, kids who are eligible under IDEA might include kids who are traumatized, but this subset definitely would, it could include kids who are traumatized because they're exposed to racism. It also includes, it's important to think about because the pandemic is having a disparate impact on students in terms of exposure to trauma due to parents' death, family members' deaths, as well as evictions from their home, loss of employment. All these things can contribute to a student experiencing trauma, and disproportionately kids of color. 504 covers a full range of disabilities, including anxiety disorders, ADHD, kids who have complex, several kinds of disorders altogether. It does not require that you find a specific diagnosis or can label. All that you have to know is that it substantially impairs a major life activity. So it also includes kids with health issues like asthma, diabetes, and moving forward, it could include kids who have symptoms of long COVID. Next slide, please. So another important piece to think about is that these students who are eligible once they're identified for mental health and behavioral supports and services, accommodations in the classroom, there is not a funding stream in the federal government. There's no federal funds earmarked to meet these needs, nor do any states that we've ever found have any specific funding for students who are identified as eligible, and in fact, where districts are obligated to meet their needs. There's no specified funding source, so they have to draw from funding for counseling and other kinds of supports for the general population. In fact, they don't show up as special ed. So when we're looking at slides later, we'll make a distinction when we're talking about 504 only and kids who are eligible for special ed. But it's important to realize that if they're not getting the supports and services they need to be successful in school, that is considered a denial of a free, appropriate public education. That is a form of disability discrimination. So they have rights and no resources, but there are some remedies. Next slide, please. So what we found in the nation, we looked at 2 years of data. We looked at several years for the national report, but if you look at the most recent 2 years for which we have data, 2015-16 school year and the 17-18 school year, you'll see here nationally, there's been an increase. So this is pre-pandemic. And there was a slight increase in California, but California was among the lowest 10 states for identifying students who had 504 eligibility. Next slide, please. The national average was nearly 3%, and that we think is been steadily increasing. So we would anticipate it's probably over 3% by now. In California, however, in that same 2017-18 school year, 934 California districts had rates that were below 1%, and 404 districts in California identified not a single eligible student. Next slide, please. So I should mention that this also has implications for school discipline, because one of the things that students with disabilities have, whether it's a 504 plan or an IEP under IDEA, is they have a right not to be suspended or excluded from school for behaviors that are caused by their disability. In fact, if that's believed to be happening, they're supposed to have a behavioral assessment and a behavioral improvement plan, and that would be included if they were 504 eligible in a 504 plan. So there should be interventions already planned for these students, but first you have to identify them to even have a chance at accessing those sorts of rights. And our other reports, and you'll see here as well, that even when students are identified, especially students of color, don't seem to be getting the kinds of supports and services for their behaviors that are related to their disabilities, because they have sky-high suspension rates and other rates of exclusion that are really quite shocking. And but in California, when we looked at districts where they weren't even being identified or being identified at very low levels, you'll notice Los Angeles is here, and it really is not. It's not 4/10, it's 400ths of a percentage of the population. 222 students in all out of over 500,000 students in all. And you can see that for Black students, the rate in many districts, if you look at that column, was 0, as well as some other groups. And white students tend to be more likely than any other group to be identified as having these needs, and that means having their rights recognized. So this is just a snapshot of some of the larger districts and how low the rates are. And we're not even looking at the ones that were total zeros across the board. Let's go to the next slide, please. So when we looked at all the districts together, the likelihood was for Black and Latinx students was about a quarter of all those students would be found in a district where the rate of identification for their group was between 0 and 0.4%. And that would be true of over 1/5 of Native American students in California, but in slightly under 10% for white students. Next slide, please. So now we're going to skip to talking about school policing data. This is also something we highlighted in our report, Disabling Inequity. We also have data on kids without disabilities that are in the spreadsheets for that report, but we focused on kids with disabilities because, in fact, when we're looking at secondary students, it is students of color with disabilities at the secondary level that are the most likely of all to be either referred to police or arrested. But there's a big problem with the data. So, and as I'll describe in more detail, well over half of all the districts with at least 1,000 students reported 0 school-related arrests and probably very low numbers of referrals to law enforcement, because every school-related arrest counts as a referral. So we don't trust those data because places like New York City and Pittsburgh, and in a prior year in 15-16, Los Angeles, they improved, but they also reported 0 school-related arrests in 2015-16. So there's a big issue with not getting accurate data on school policing. So that doesn't mean we just throw out all the data and say, well, we can't look at it. And it's really important to figure out how to use it. And that's what we've done in our Disabling Inequity report, and which we will do when new data come out. But I want to say that across the nation, what we did is we only looked at districts that had at least 1,000 secondary students in them and reported at least 1 school-related arrest, and then we further narrowed it down, and they had to have at least 1 referral. Remember that every arrest is a referral. So, and that dramatically reduce the number of districts that we're looking at, but at least we knew that in these districts, there was some reporting of school policing data. And that doesn't mean that these were not under reports. So we are concerned that even where there are data reported, that they are not reporting the accurate rates. Let's go to the next slide. In California, after we did this filtering, if we just looked at and we further filtered to look at districts where at least 2% of the students with disabilities were referred to law enforcement. And there were 44 districts in California, and that's quite high. And the range went as high as over 12% of all enrolled students with disabilities. Apple Valley Unified was the highest at 12.38%. That literally means 1 in 8 students with disabilities at the secondary level were referred to the police at least once that 1 year. And the per district average for those 44 districts was over 4% of the students with disabilities. Let's go to the next slide. So here are some of the, we looked at among kids with disabilities and those without disabilities, we looked at some of the large districts where there was a really large difference between Black and white students. And so the top column is Black secondary students, and what is the likelihood that they were referred to law enforcement at least once. And this really means that 1 in 9 for San Jacinto, 1 in 9 Black students with disabilities at the secondary level were referred to law enforcement. That's much higher than Black students without disabilities. But you can see next to them, white students without disabilities, it was 1.4%. And, white students with disabilities in that district also had a much elevated rate for students with disabilities compared to those without. But so for every racial group, it's extremely consistent that the students with disabilities are being referred to the police much more often. But when we add race, we see that especially for Black students with disabilities, there's a clear to-prison pipeline in some of these districts with the frequency. And this begs the question, shouldn't these students have behavioral interventions and behavioral improvement plans that would prevent the necessity of calling the police? Because if there are disability-related behaviors, they're supposed to have those met through specialized plans that address those behaviors in a way that doesn't kick them out of school and doesn't put them into detention or the juvenile justice system. So this is really quite egregious and is often overlooked. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the other thing that, speaking of overlooked, is a problem. So we talked about how much of the data on school policing still is under the radar because it's not being reported. And I should point out the state of California remains out of compliance with the requirements of the data collection on these issues. And they had promised to collect the data a year ago, but it didn't come. It might have been collected. They may be sitting on it. This is something we'll have to explore further, but it's important to get this information, especially with all the concerns about policing in general and racism and abusive and excessive practices. But these are the same police that are patrolling the hallways of our schools in some cases. Other kinds of off-the-book suspensions include, especially for kids with disabilities, early dismissals, students just told to take a break, but it's not being reported as a suspension. And that for kids with disabilities, they have some additional legal protections that can kick in when the total number of days exceeds 10. So if they're off the book suspension, that means that their procedural protections often won't be recognized. And they're also not on this list, but things like disciplinary transfers and disenrollment. But other than disenrollment, many of these types of dismissals, I'm not sure about early dismissal, but many of these other types of off-the-book suspensions could show up in absent in attendance records. So let's go to the next slide. So fortunately, the state of California does collect good data on chronic absenteeism. And this chronic absenteeism, you have to miss a lot of school I believe in California, it's 10% of the total school year. And the point is that when you miss that amount of school, it has huge implications, but it's also a way to capture, to look at this sort of data element when you're worried about off the book suspensions contributing to lost instructional time. And what this also shows is that the more you drill down into some of the cross-sectional issues, so we're looking here at race, and then race, we have race with and without disabilities, but we've also, because of some of the good data practices in the state of California, we can look at race by disability, by low income status, and by homelessness. And by far, it is the students who are homeless, and we know that COVID has contributed to a very serious homeless problem in the state of California. And it's those students and students of color with disabilities who are homeless that are just missing tremendous, and this is, remember, pre-COVID data. So 54%, over 50% of Black students and American Indians were chronically absent, and there are higher rates for other groups, high rates for other homeless groups of kids with disabilities as well. But this is another data point that you can also in California look at the district level. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the things, I saw a note in the comment, but I couldn't, the message was truncated. Let's see.
Don't worry, Dan.
Okay.
There's lots of good stuff happening in the chat, so all good.
Okay, great. So the benefits, of tracking rates over time, whether you're looking at chronic absenteeism or, what we've done in our California reports is looked at different rates of discipline and looked at all the different subgroups to the degree that we could, is to ask these questions about, are we making progress? So there have been some important policy changes, and then many districts have invested in different kinds of interventions. But it's really important to use the data to try to evaluate. And the state has, as part of their statewide accountability system, they're one of, I think, the only state or one of two that looks at school discipline and rates of discipline as part of a statewide accountability system. And that's really important, but it can lead to off the book suspensions, and it can also lead to giving a false sense of improvement. And so looking at the trends is really important. So it's also important that when we're looking at districts that we look at several different indices so that we don't put too much praise on a district that looks like they've reduced their suspension rates. Yet when you really drill down into the data, maybe it's the group you're most concerned at actually increased their suspension rate. So those are the sorts of things that we're going to talk about next. Let's go to the next slide. So in this slide, we have the back row, which is the suspension rates for all suspensions. And then the other categories are less serious types of offenses. So the category of disruption or defiance is the next second from the back. So it starts at 5.4% of all students suspended for disruption or fines. And you can see it goes down to, I believe it's around less than 1%, 0.8% in 2018-19. You can see the trends. Now, a lot of people were worried that what we call the whack-a-mole problem, that as you reduce in one category, in part because of the legal changes, and now it's up to grade 8, that you're not allowed to use this category. You're not allowed to suspend students just for being disruptive or defiant. But what about violence incident with no injury? And I consider this not a serious offense because this could be any kind of scuffle in the hallway. It could be a fight, but no one's hurt. And so the fact that there is another category about violence with injury, and there are many categories for other serious offenses. So did this increase? And what you can see is that it did decrease. It did not increase, but not as much. but there was a decrease in the violent incident, no injury category. At the same time, these other rates are going down. And the other reasons category, which combines several sort of minor things, also did not show a corresponding increase. So this would be important to look at the district level as well, because the more accountability we have, the more we're concerned about, things like off the books suspensions, or just moving the offense category, moving the how you describe the student's behavior to avoid the restriction that is statewide on the use of suspensions for disruption only. Next slide, please. The other thing that we really stress is to look at how much instructional time. Those slides I just showed you were based on unduplicated counts of students suspended at least one time. But that means that a student who is suspended once for one day is treated equally as a student suspended 10 times in the same year for 10 days each time. So we really, to get the impact on educational opportunity, and this really speaks to an opportunity gap, we need to look at how much instructional time is being lost. It's also the metric that triggers whether or not there are due process rights for the kids with disabilities, both the 504 and students with IEPs. If they're suspended for more than 10 days, there's a special inquiry to look at whether or not their behavior was caused by their disability or by a failure to provide appropriate supports and services. So the method is very simple. We counted all out of school and in school suspensions, and based on our analysis of data from a few districts, as well as an actual collection in 2017-18, we assigned a value of 2 days for every suspension. And that's how we came up with the total days, and then we divide that by the enrollment and multiply by 100 to get a comparable rate of lost instruction. So it's the days lost per 100 students. So let's go to the next slide. So it's, and we'll get into the actual data in a minute, but it's important to also remember that from here on out, the data from the 19-20 school year are preliminary. So sometimes there are some changes. We discover an error in the file that was sent to us, or maybe we made a mistake. I don't think that's the case, but we have not released a report and we haven't finalized any of the data on the 19-20 school year. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here we have, this is without the days of lost instruction. So we're using this to show you the value of looking at days of lost instruction. But this first slide shows you 2018-19 and 2019-20. This is just one district that happened to be very high suspending. In fact, there was an increase in the Black suspension rate, but look at all students. So the all student suspension rate shows a lower level from 2019-20, and we haven't even done what we're going to do soon, which is project what it would have been had there been a full year. So this is based on comparing 2/3 of a year, which was 2019-20, to the prior year in this district, and you can see the risk, the likelihood that a student who was Black was suspended went up considerably. Now, there's something unusual about Lennox, though, that we have to look at more carefully, in that their number of total enrolled students went down quite a bit. And so those are some other kinds of things that's important to look at when you look at data on your own district. Was there a dramatic change in the enrollment of one group or across the board? That could indicate an error in the reporting, or a change in governance structure, or introduction of lots of charter schools. There could be a lot of reasons for that. So let's go to the next slide. But just for the purposes of this demonstration, we haven't verified 100% that the enrollment didn't mess with the analysis in this case, but look at how different it is when we look at the days of lost instruction. 114 days per 100 Black students, this is K through 12 numbers now, were lost, and that's up from 50 days. And of course, white students are at 0. There were 35 white students, which is a small number, but still enough, especially 2 years in a row. this is very troubling to look at this. This suggests to me need for further investigation. But if we consistently find that white students are not suspended, but students of color are, that suggests a dual system of discipline and could be an example of some very explicit racial discrimination. Of course, these are just data, so you can't draw that conclusion, but it raises those questions. Let's go to the next slide. Now, we looked at the data. This is just looking at the 2/3 of the school year. The data from 2019-2020, because of COVID, ended after 2/3 of the school year, where it was technically 68% of the time. But that's approximately just slightly over 2/3 of the school year. So we're going to use that metric of 2/3 to moving forward. But if you just look at the data presented, and you can just look at the current year, you can see dramatic disparities in the rates of lost instruction. This really speaks to the inequitable opportunity. These are K-12 data. If we further disaggregated and looked at across, let's say grades 7 and 8, I guarantee you that these numbers would be much, much higher. In other words, as kids get older, the racial gaps grow and the opportunity gaps, in other words, grow. And this is a very serious concern, especially in districts like Antioch, Barstow Unified, and Tulare Joint Unified High School. But even smaller differences are very important to pay attention to. We're just illustrating the depth of the problem. Let's go to the next slide. So we, in our forthcoming report, it's definitely at the state level and for some districts, and we might do it for every district, project the rates of lost instruction, because we want to make sure that districts are not suggesting that the 1920 rates, if they're lower than they were in 2018, necessarily means that they're doing something different or have improved or have addressed this problem successfully. So it's a very simple calculation. If we sort of round up to 68%, if we round that to 66%, that's 2/3 of the school year. And to add another third, you take half of the current rate, 50%, and add it, and then you get 3/3. You get from 2/3, you take 1/2 of 2/3 is a third, so you add that, and it's like adding 50% of the what you can see, and that gives you the full year. Let's go to the next slide. So we can skip this. I think I explained this. I'll explain this in the context of this slide. So here's Antioch. If you were to look at the data from 2019-20, just as reported, you would see that it went from 85% for Black students, 85 days lost per 100 students, down to 67. But if you imagine the rest of the school year and a consistently, what we've seen up through 2/3 of the year being consistent, it would actually represent the 67. We add another third, which is the same as adding 50%. We get to 100 days lost per 100 Black students. So it really suggests that there was an increase in Antioch, not a decrease. What we don't want to do is just compare 2019-20 to the prior year, which is a full year. That's an apples and oranges. And so we will provide this kind of information for the state as well as across many of these large districts. And you can see that white students also were suspended at just tiny bit lower rate than they were the prior year when we do this projection. However, the racial difference has expanded in Antioch. Let's go to the next slide. So here we have from our last report, which was released last summer, this is statewide data on the amount of lost instruction due to suspension, and it shows you every year. So it went, if you look, the top line is Black students. On average, it used to be 64 days lost per 100 students. Now it was down to 36 in 2018-19. So and you can see that for each of the racial groups. That's the other thing. In our spreadsheets, we cover every single racial and ethnic group in the state of California, and we do this nationally too. But for the simplicity of the webinar, we often only look at, say, Black and whites or certain racial and ethnic groups. Let's go to the next slide. So here are some of the statewide differences. So when we look at all students, the total rate of lost instruction was 11.5 days. And then we just treated the 2019-20 school year as if it were a full year, it would look like it went down to 7.6. But when we project another 50%, it goes up to 11.4, which means a slight decline. And these are not precise measures. So but I think it's safe to say things stayed about the same for all students. But look what happened with Black students. Black students looks like they went down by 10 days per 100, but in fact, they went up slightly. Now, we can't be sure that that's the case because we're just projecting that last segment of the school year, but they certainly were on the path to having higher rates of lost instruction per 100 students. And that's really very discouraging. And also, you know, another reason that we have to really address these issues at the district level and, you know, not assume that just because there were some changes made that we've actually made sufficient progress. Let's go to the next slide. And one of the things that we point out, we don't have more recent data analyzed yet but something that we're also encouraging folks to do is that there are districts in California where some districts have their own alternative schools, but many of them are run by the County Office of Education. So the County Office of Education schools, COES, disaggregated by race and ethnicity. When we look at the amount of lost instruction, look at Black students who are attending schools run by the County Offices of Education across the state have much, much higher rates of lost instruction per 100 students than any other group. And compared to what's in regular districts, it's almost 3 times as high. So this is really troubling news. And we will, we're hoping to work with folks at the National Lawyers, the National Center for Youth Law to do a deeper dive into what's going on in alternative schools in California. Let's go to the next slide. We also have looked at the race, gender differences. And one of the good things that California does is it allows for further disaggregation by low income and by grade level. So this is new. I don't believe that all this data is available in the downloadable version of the data, but you can go to DataQuest and find this information, and you can find this for any district. And I believe they posted this for 2019-20 as well. But this is important because when you look at this cross-section of race with disability and low income and a certain grade level, in this case 7-8, which is the grade level which often has the highest use of suspension, can see that Black students on average were losing 149 days for every 100 Black students that meet this category. And that's males, Black male students, I'm sorry. So this has race, gender, disability status, income status, and the cross-sectional grade. So the more you drill down, sometimes we see the kids that are really have serious needs for a variety of reasons or are more likely to be discriminated against, you know, and we look at that in combination, we see some rates that really should shock the conscience. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things that we looked at in our report that was released last summer, and we haven't updated this research, but Paul Martinez, who now has a PhD based on this research, was leading the way on this. And he found, and we published the results, that when we looked at California's high schools, those that had a larger security staff to student ratios tended to have higher rates of lost instruction across the board. And then when we just looked at high schools that had at least 100 Black students in them, we found even stronger correlation between the presence of security staff and higher rates of lost instruction for Black students. And we also found that when we looked at social workers and counselors, nurses, and psychologists, those are student support staff, when their ratio was improved, there was more support staff per student, that's when the rates of lost instruction went down for Black students. Let's go to the next slide. I've talked already about some of the missing and incomplete data on school policing. Let's go to the next slide. But this also comes up in terms of, in California, we have a system to look at the spending on kids with high needs through the LCAP budget appropriations. And in this case, we have recently found, it wasn't our work, but advocates in the state found misappropriations of the funds. And there was a case brought, complaint filed against Fresno Unified School District that was investigated by the state, and they did find that they were using funds designated for high needs students for their education, and they were spending that money on school police and custodial services. And led by the Pomona Student Union youth organizer, and also public advocates, the ACLU of Southern California, and there may be other groups as well. They did a review of districts in Southern California and found 35 school districts where this was a problem, where the apparent problem, where they found schools that should have been earmarked for high needs kids being spent on school police as well as custodial services. Let's go to the next slide. So it's important to note that in California, we do have, as I mentioned earlier, system accountability. And however, there are problems with it. So it's really important also to note that there have been several legislative bills that were passed with the support of fixed school discipline campaigns and other advocates in the state, and their voice has been really leading the way, as well as you know, there's a warning system as part of the, it's not just you're you know, flagged in the state accountability system as having a problem or not. So it's a color-coded system. They also have a flag system for disparities by race and socioeconomic status. So those things are good. However, even the smallest amount of progress can make you look better. And the way the system is set up, they're not looking at trends over time. They're just looking at the prior year, but they're ignoring. So you could have a huge increase in the use of suspensions for Black students one year and go down slightly the next. And your all student rate might have gone down like it did in Antioch, and you'll get credit as for making progress, even though the experiences of Black students has gotten markedly worse when you look over several years of data. So it's important to look at the long-term trend. It's important to look at the subgroups we're most important about, that we're most concerned about, and elevate their importance in evaluating whether progress has been made, and also consider ways we can look at off-the-books suspensions. Let's go to the next.
Hi, Dan. I'm just going to give you a 1-minute warning because there's been so many important questions in the chat. We are going to ask you to close in about a minute so we can get to some of those.
Well, I got the last two slides, so here we go. Principles for remedies. So I think I've made most of these points, but injustice calls for action. So, and you know, California districts are set up for having some budget dedicated towards school improvement because of the LCAP. It's important to take leadership guidance, not just guidance, but actually put the folks who are most affected by this in leadership roles. And so we really should be taking measures to ensure that we're listening to the folks in the community, especially from those groups who are most harmed by some of these practices. But also remember that in the long term, we want solutions that are changing the hearts and minds of the educators. Let's go to the next. This is my last slide. So I'll end by saying, you know, when my son was in kindergarten, he said, "Daddy, today I learned the Pledge of Illusions." And so I thought I'd point out that the Pledge of Illusions is what happens when we're not looking at the data carefully enough. And it ends with liberty and justice for no one. And it's important to really insist on getting the data on school discipline, but in a way that really helps you understand whether or not there are improvements or not, looking at policing, looking at many different slices of the data together. So the last slide is just how you can contact me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for all of the dialogue happening in the chat. I think we have a mix of a lot of educators, advocates, organizers, and before Maureen gets into some specific questions for the team to answer, I'll just, underscore that in our policy coalition, we do have some experienced educators for folks who work at CLEAR, at Fresno. There's a lot of different things happening, but this webinar was not an evaluation of implementation of alternatives to zero tolerance. So I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of important dialogue happening in the chat, and there's a lot of different resources across the state and the country. So thanks for your grace if we aren't getting to everything of the dialogue in the chat. Now I'll pass to Maureen to try to synthesize. There was a lot happening.
Yeah, thanks so much. So the first question was, in these school districts with high racial disproportionalities for their arrest rates that Dan was showing us earlier at the beginning, do you have any knowledge of the interventions in place in those schools? For example, do any of them use PBIS or restorative justice programs?
We did not. We might. That would be something that we may want to do moving forward. Remember, those data from 2017-18. The state of California is out of compliance and is not reporting their school policing data to the public. It's a requirement of the Every Student Succeeds Act. They said they were going to collect at least the data on arrests for 2019-20 school year, but we have yet to see it. So I can't really, I don't know, but we need the data.
Yeah, and then they also asked, do we know of any trainings that are happening at the local level for teachers to manage behaviors? No.
In terms of, we haven't done that sort of deep dive into individual school districts, so I really can't speak to that. We have done a little bit. I shouldn't say we haven't done any. We have a whole book on closing the school discipline gap, but it's several years old at this point, but it does include research by other researchers that looks at different kinds of interventions and whether or not it had an impact on the racial disparities. So we do look into that, and we're very interested in that, because it's important to look at where there's progress and understand what contributed to it. But again, as we're pointing out here, you have to look at more than just one slice of the data, and it's important to be able to see what's I think I forgot to say, in Los Angeles, for Black students with disabilities, their rates of referral to law enforcement is higher than their rates of out-of-school suspension. And it didn't get higher when the rates came down. It's always been at a certain sort of level, but now that suspension rates are coming down, it is now higher, and that's really disturbing. What it really suggests to me is that no one has really taken, and well, I know there are advocates in Los Angeles are doing a lot on this topic, but it had, and just recently they changed the funding for some of the school policing, but there's still quite a bit more that needs to be done on that topic.
Yeah, and kind of along the same lines, it was asked, what are some of the districts that have the lower disciplinary numbers doing to maintain those low numbers?
So in all of our reports, both the ones that cover every district in the nation, as well as the ones that cover every district in the state of California, you can find the data on your district, and this is really important. And when we finish our 2019-2020 data, you'll also find the data there, and we'll probably prorate at least the, add that extra 50% so people can see the difference. And so you can find that on the websites that are listed here.
Great. Another question was, where should districts be keeping their reported arrests? In their student information system?
Yes, in fact, according to the Every Student Succeeds Act, which advocates across the country really push for this provision, I'm not saying they supported everything in there, but there's a reporting requirement for districts and for every state, and it includes a requirement that every district report data on not just in and out of school suspensions and expulsions, but school-related arrests and all referrals. And all referrals should be a larger category because that's all the ticketing. Anytime someone calls the police on students, that's a referral, no matter what the outcome is.
Got it. So another question was, what about also accounting for sexual orientation of students, their gender identity, and using their gender identity as a factor along with race, homelessness, and disability? Have we thought about doing that? Have we done that before?
So with other advocacy groups, I have done, been part of efforts to get the U.S. Department of Ed to start collecting that data, including it as part of the OCR data. And I know there are groups in California that have been, part of the efforts in the state. A lot of the discipline data is not disaggregated by it is by gender, but not by any kind of sexual orientation, LGBTQ status. But that is something that I think we have to say this is not acceptable. And certainly at the high schools where students, there is privacy issues and whatnot, but there's a respectful way to do this. And I think it's part of normalizing the whole range of sexual orientation is collecting data on those students and reporting it to the public.
Yes, definitely. Along those same lines, it was asked if we have data on the category of English learners.
We have, and we could include them in future reports. We are certainly concerned about, the school to deportation pipeline, and that is a serious problem. One of the things that in most districts, actually, the English learners have lower suspension rates where we have looked at the data. So we focus a lot of our attention on the groups that are, at least in the data, showing much higher rates. Now, it could be that English learners are more prone to the off the books kinds of suspensions, especially if their parents, for example, might be undocumented, which is more likely for an English learner. So they may be, issues with the collection and reporting that data that, deserve to be looked at more closely.
Okay, Jose has just chatted a survey. Obviously, 1 hour was not enough time but we're just scratching the surface. Thank you all for your attention. Also, I was monitoring chat, so I don't know yet, Maureen, if you and Dan were able to coordinate about that. We got several questions about receiving the actual slides. So if we already shared that this is being recorded. It will be posted to our websites in the next coming weeks. But if Dan's team is willing to share the slides as a PDF, Jose can share, those slides. Okay, so we can send that to all of you. If you can do the survey, click on it now and complete it in a couple minutes. But then if you had questions you didn't get answered also, and then, yes, sorry, just because there's questions, yet we look a lot at solutions. If you go to the website, as we shared at the beginning, we have documented with progressive educators focused on racial justice across the state, but that just wasn't, Dan and his team it's also very important to tell the story. We still have plenty of schools in the state that have 10% suspension rates. It's not all done. And so sharing the data is important. But yes, you can go to our website, you can fill out the survey, and there's a lot of different resources we can connect you with regarding actual implementation, fidelity, and implicit bias work by educators. So thank you all. Dan, you want to say a final word before we close?
Yes. And we listed both my phone number and my email, and you can send questions to me that you didn't have answered, or other inquiries, or also, if you know of either a problem, and it doesn't have to be in a California district, because we're both national in scope with, a real focus on what's going on in California. So we would certainly respond to your email as best we can. Thank you. Thank you, Fixed School Discipline too.